In this lecture, I will mostly talk about time. In the Western conception, time is divided up into three parts: past, present, and future. In other conceptions, this is not always the case. There is no future in Peru is something I hear from Peruvians all the time, and I have learned that it represents two things. First, at the most superficial level, is the notion that the current generation must be sacrificed for the future of the next. At this level, the refrain, "there is no future in Peru," can be interpreted, "there is no future for my kids in Peru, so I'm going to sacrifice my current successful career there in order to immigrate with my kids to the US." Why the US? Because the US is seen as the place where the future was invented. As you will read this week in many of the tasks, there is this evolutionary scale of progress for countries from the third world to the first world. And the US draws itself at the most evolved stage. Whatever the US happens to be doing at the time, that represents the culmination of human civilization, the apex. And since it is an evolution, all other countries will eventually get there. So if you go directly to the US, it's like you are skipping ahead to the future of your own country. You are traveling through time to the future, a future time where you are paid much more for your labor than you were in your home country. That makes sense, right? We all know that even here in the US, people's wages have gone up over time. So Grandpa Simpson made 5 cents an hour selling beer, and now young people make $10 an hour selling boba. Well, why not go to a space where the time is always in the future tense? For Peruvians, that future space-time is the US. So right now in the US, we are practicing a form of government that is supposed to be the combination of the most advanced notions of both time and labor. That form of government is called neoliberalism. So the US rates everyone else in the world as good or bad, depending on how closely they follow neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is supposed to bring all nations up to the level of the first world stage of evolution. David Harvey defined neoliberalism as a theory of political economic practices that proposes that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedom and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. The role of the government is to create and preserve an institutional framework appropriate to such practices. So basically, neoliberalism means that the market is the cure for all social ills. So this means that all industries should be privatized and there should be no social welfare. People should take responsibility for their own welfare. As you can see on the cover of Harvey's book, Ronald Reagan started this in the US and Margaret Thatcher in the UK in the 80s. But before the US dared try it in the US, they experimented with it in Chile. They killed the democratically elected president there, Salvador Allende, because he was nationalizing US-controlled mining operations in Chile. And in his place, they installed a dictator named Augusto Pinochet. They told Pinochet that if he wanted to borrow money from the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, which are controlled by the US, he had to neoliberalize Chile. So he did. And it worked. In what way? Did it eliminate poverty? No, but it made Chile look more like the US. It increased Chile's level on that evolutionary hierarchy defined by the US. The same thing happened in Peru in the 90s under Alberto Fujimori. He wanted to borrow money, and so the US said, that's fine as long as you neoliberalize your nation. So he did. Why does the US want neoliberalism? Because if instead of nationalizing industries, a nation privatizes all of its industries and industries and utilities, then US businesses can go in and buy those industries. From the point of view of Peruvians who see the US as the pinnacle of human achievement, neoliberalism is also a good thing because it pushes their country closer to the US notions of labor and time. But it is never close enough. For many Peruvians, the US is the only place where one's labor is compensated fairly. And, and so there is no future in Peru. Like one of my Peruvian friends told me, as you know, Peru doesn't give much of a future. My husband is a police officer and he only makes 1,000 soles a month. Most professionals that graduate from the university will make 1,200 or 1,500 soles in the best of jobs. And maybe if it is the absolute best, 1,800. And that isn't enough. And we are talking here about good professional jobs like nurses. So you can imagine that the non-professions make even less. I am investigating the possibility of immigration because I'd like my daughter to have a future. And that is why I asked in the university what it would be like to get a student visa to the US for her. Notice how she says that isn't enough. Enough for whom? It is enough to live a Peruvian lifestyle, but it is not enough to fund a US lifestyle. It is as if the Western concept of time equals money has become imposed on the rest of the world. Time is supposed to equal money, and when it doesn't, the country where it doesn't seems broken. The time equals money equation is broken in Peru, and so there is no future in Peru. Another reason people say there is no future in Peru is deeper than simply idolizing the US. At a deep ancestral level, Peruvians deny the existence of future in Peru because in pre-conquest Tawantinsuyo, the name of the area of what is now Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Colombia, and northern Chile, there literally was no concept of future. In ancient Tawantinsuyo, what one saw ahead was the past, not the future. In fact, the word for eyes in some Tawantinsuyana languages is the same for the word past. Tawantinsuyana, time, is cyclical, interrupted by major events, but those events from the distant past can change, incorporating new additions into myths that Westerners would consider to be in the immutable past. That is a practice long held in the Andes. This provided for a lot of confusion when Westerners met Andeans for the first time. This notion that the past lies ahead led to a tradition of quickly incorporating great change from the present into existing origin myths of the past. When Christians arrived in 1532, they were seen as fundamentally different from Andeans, as belonging to a separate epoch. So the Andean myth of the First Age changed to one about an enmity between Andeans and Christians, in which the Christians were all expelled. The Augustinian missionaries, however, interpreted the myth differently. They believed that the Christians of that earlier Andean epoch were proof that, long ago, the gospel had been preached in the Andes by one of Christ's apostles. So just like Delaney noticed in Turkey, in contemporary Peru, time indeed flows differently than it does in the US. In fact, Peruvian time corresponds to the stage labeled underdeveloped in globalization models that rank the world in terms of evolutionary stages culminating in modern capitalism. Modern capitalism is simply a phrase that means whatever the US happens to be doing. One white US citizen I met in Peru even quantified chronologically where Peru falls on this unilinear evolutionary progression as being 20 years behind Chile, which he thought was itself 20 years behind the US. A young Mormon couple from Idaho that I interviewed in Arequipa told me their goal had long been to live in Peru for 3 months, and that, like training for a marathon, they had deliberately worked up the ability to live in Peru, which they considered a third world country, by first living in Mexico, which they considered a second world country. As you will read in the article by E.P. Thompson, he explores the way notions of time have become inextricable from the labels on this evolutionary hierarchy, from horticulture to agriculture to mercantilism to industrialism and finally to Fordism, which is the factory assembly line. Human bodies habituated in a Fordist economy have internalized arbitrary units of time as the natural units of work. They work to spend a monetized amount of time rather than to complete a set task. This is part of what anthropologists call the naturalization of work. In the US, work is naturalized, meaning we think we are supposed to work all the time. Even if we don't believe in the Bible, which says, "By the sweat of thy brow shalt thou eat thy bread all the days of thy life," we still keep that commandment. Even if we don't believe in the Bible, we totally live by biblical ideals. As Sarah Beskey and Alex Blanchette wrote, the naturalization of work usually refers to social processes that make a life underpinned by labor seem unquestionable, inevitable, and even desirable. This kind of naturalization is visible in many sites, from popular summons to treat one's job as a calling, to the growth of various administrative positions that make more work for others. Fledgling calls to denaturalize work and find ways to organize society around other dimensions of being human are also emerging today, such as the increasingly popular but ambiguous idea of a universal basic income. Democrats and Republicans in the US seem very different, opposites, in fact, but they are both neoliberal and they both share one idea. Capitalism's varied crises can be mitigated by putting more and more human bodies to work. It is likely no coincidence that this shared faith emerges at a moment of fretting that technology, from robots to genetically engineered organisms, will inevitably decrease the demand for human labor. Both Democrats and Republicans are haunted by the prospect of a surplus population stripped of its natural working identity. Outside mainstream politics, there is no shortage of contemporary journalism and scholarship that critiques the increasingly precarious conditions of labor. And there are inspiring efforts to realize a world where work is more justly remunerated under more dignified conditions. But there is relatively less critical questioning of the institution of work itself, or of the central role work plays in shaping everyday hierarchies, identities, and environments. As the political theorist Kathy Weeks puts it, the social role of waged work has been so naturalized as to seem necessary and inevitable, something that might be tinkered with but never escaped. Work occupies an outsized amount of social time and imagination, such that it is difficult to imagine life unfettered by its dictates.